All right, writing a method. This should be about the third section of your report for a student experiment. So there's two main parts to this. There's the modification to the method, and then there's the risks and management, and you should have these under subheadings. We show you it as 3.1 and 3.2. So for modifications to your method, for good marks, you need to really clearly explain and justify the method modifications that you've made. So the first part of 3.1 is you need to briefly describe the method of the original experiment that you completed in class and chose to modify. This only needs to be 1 to 2 sentences. You should be concise but also specific. If the experiment came from a book, you would reference it in this section. You also need to put the original experiment in the appendix of your report. So that's the end part of your report, and it's also not marked. So you need to make sure you've got it in there, and then you can reference to it. So say your full method is in the appendix. Then once you've introduced your original experiment, you're then going to introduce your new method. So you should describe the new method that your group's using. It should not be step by step. It should be in paragraph format in third person past tense, and it should be 3 to 4 sentences describing the overall process in enough detail to show that your method will enable a collection of sufficient and relevant data to answer your research question. Now, if you are doing this and you realize that your research question does not link to your experiment, you are able to change your research question. It is a working research question. So if you look at your method and you look at the data that you're collecting and you realize that potentially it's not going to answer your research question well, then change your research question. They should link and they should align. If they don't, that's an issue. So I've put down there that we should be able to perform your experiment again by what you've described in this section. So you need to be really explicit. How many trials were performed? What concentrations or colors or whatever you're changing as your independent variable, what was used? How large were the beakers? How much Olodia did you use? It should be really specific, and you shouldn't leave out any detail, because the last part, you need to justify each and every modification that you've made. And you need to have a clear justification. If your modifications aren't justified, then that really brings your grade down. It should say why it's going to improve the quality of your data. The second part, so this is 3.2, safety, environmental and ethical considerations. This can be done in a table or paragraph form. Either is fine. So in this section, you need to identify all significant risks and possible harm that could occur doing this experiment. For each risk, you need to explain how to manage this. So if you were doing it in a table, it would look like risks, and then right next to it, management techniques, because that way, if you've got it in a table, it's going to align and you can make sure that all the risks that you're talking about are being straight away explained how they're managing it. If you're doing it in a paragraph, I would state the risk and then straight away state how it's being managed or what considerations are being put in place. Because if you state all the risks and then try and state all the management techniques, you're going to miss out on something. So put them straight after each other, however you do it, whether it's a table or whether it's a paragraph. If you're using chemicals, then you should be reading the SDS for that chemical and then you should reference it. So if you're doing anything, you need to try and find references for this, and these should be evident in your in-text referencing. So you should be in-text referencing throughout this whole report. Just because it's a method doesn't mean it's not being in-text referenced. So you need to be really explicit. So the example here is for chemistry, but the same thing applies. So the chemical was poured carefully. You do not say that things are done carefully. What does that mean? What does carefully mean? You need to be really explicit. So it could be replaced with, when pouring the chemical, the stock bottle was held close to the top of the conical flask so the chemical was unlikely to spill on the bench. You need to be really explicit. Don't just say it was done safely. It was done carefully. What does that mean? A risk cutting yourself. That's not a risk. A risk is maybe a beaker breaking and then that's leading to someone being cut. Well, how would you fix that? Don't say, hold the test tube carefully. That's not explicit, and it's not enough detail. And it really doesn't mean anything. Hold it carefully, hold it safely. What's that mean? All right, the last part of 3.2 is your environmental and ethical considerations. Ethical considerations and how to manage them. This could lead to morally what's right or wrong. Is any animals being hurt? Is there any humans being hurt? Things like that. Environmental, could something in your experiment lead to any environmental issues? Okay, so if you're using chemicals and you're pouring it down the drain, think about that. If you're acting upon an environment or an ecosystem, that would have some environmental issues. So those are what you need to look at. You need to reference any of those management ways or any of those risks. If you look at your experiment and you feel there's no significant ethical or environmental risks, you need to state that. And it says make a statement to that effect. It could be something like, there were no significant ethical or environmental risks that were present in this experiment. Done. And then you've at least considered it. Now, your marking on your ISMG, there's 3 different dot points that align straight to your method. So if we're looking at this whole ISMG for research and planning, you've got 1 dot point for your rationale, you've got 1 dot point for your research question, and then 3 for your method. So that means that if your method is rubbish, you're going to struggle with this ISMG, this criteria. So make sure that you have justified modifications, because the alternate is that you have feasible modifications and that's dropped you potentially 3 points. Methodology that enables sufficient and relevant data collection. So you need to, the difference is the sufficient and data. So if you are not getting enough data, then that's going to affect your grade here. We like to talk about having 15 data points so that you have enough data that you could find a trend using your averages and things like that. And then you need to have a considered management of risks and ethical or environmental issues. So if you're not doing both, see, we'll move this down. See here, it's got and as well. So if you are technically not talking about the ethical or environmental issues and or, you will not get anything more than possibly a 2 because it doesn't align to either of these criteria. You need to make sure that you do not forget the ethical or environmental issues, otherwise you will very much get marked down. You need to have all of them. Even if it's just a statement that says there were none, that at least means that you've considered it. And once again, we've got our communication. So our communication here, same as the whole way through the report, it's fluent and concise use of scientific language and representations, appropriate use of genre. So that's things like writing in third person past tense, making sure that you've got the headings that you need to do. And then acknowledgement of sources through referencing. So are your references done correctly and throughout the whole report?